Good evening, AP and CCP U.S. history students. Today we're going to talk about the Civil War from secession to Reconstruction. So, how do we go from 1860, the election of 1860, which is what we've talked about up until this time period? How do we go from the election of Lincoln into the Civil War? How do we navigate through the Civil War? And then what do we do at the tail end to kind of bring the country back together, to sew it back together after 4 years of bloody conflict? Well, secession was happening already before Lincoln ever took the oath of office. If you remember from our previous discussions, Lincoln gets elected in 1860 and doesn't take office until March of 1861. Because remember, Inauguration Day wasn't until March 4th in the original version of the Constitution. So Lincoln's inauguration is about 4 months plus after the actual election, which gives plenty of time for fallout. And some of the fallout is that southern states led by South Carolina started to say that they were never going to admit Lincoln as president of the United States. They were never going to see him as president. And the reason was he didn't even appear on the ballot in many of the southern states. The Republican Party did not have a footing in the South. And basically, the election kind of was a conduit for them to say, that's not my president. He was not on my ballot. Therefore, since he was not an option, he's not going to be president of the United States. There were, of course, people screaming and yelling that he was an abolitionist at heart, that he truly was, the most radical of all of the Republicans to come in, all these different claims, which this happens under normal elections. We've seen it, of course, how many times were people yelling things about Trump or yelling things about Biden that were extremist in nature, but not necessarily true. So you're going to get this no matter what when it comes to election cycles. Well, same thing happens in 1860. Lincoln, before he ever takes office, before he ever takes the oath of office, before he ever gives his inaugural address, has to face the fact that 5 states all declare that they are leaving the Union, that they are seceding for things that they think will happen. Okay, so they kind of say, well, we see the wind, which way the wind's blowing, and Lincoln will kind of like take it to the next level. So Lincoln's job at this point, at least in his mindset, is to try and quell the fears, to try and calm things down, and to try and bring the nation back together. That's why in his first inaugural address, he basically says, look, you've messed up, you decided to leave, but we want you to come back in. We don't want this. There's no reason to have warfare. Let's talk this out. So even Lincoln is trying at the very beginning to sew the country back together. In his mind, and this is key to Lincoln, they never actually left. In his mind, it was illegal for them to leave. Because keep in mind, Lincoln is a believer from the fragment that we read, the fragment on the Constitution, that the apple of gold is the Declaration of Independence. And since they all signed that collectively, since they all signed the Declaration of Independence and left as a unit, he believes that all states coming together in the United States from that point on were going to be one unit. He was one of the few that kind of viewed it very similar to there's a historian who's since passed on, a guy named Shelby Foote, who used to say that before the war, it was the United States are. Okay, the plural, that states are plural. It's not until after the Civil War that they start calling the United States is as a one firm unit. So the war actually does that. It brings us together and creates a nation for the first time, at least in Foote's estimation. Lincoln felt that same way too. So Foote is pretty accurate in his depiction or his kind of culminating assumption that Lincoln's purpose was to create one nation. Okay. So Lincoln believes that wholeheartedly, that South Carolina can write and say we secede, that we're out, but they never actually legally left. He thought that this rebellion was an illegal rebellion, that you can't just leave, you can't just check out. We all seceded from Great Britain together, and we all signed a constitution together, the frame as it was, the silver frame around the Declaration. We all signed that constitution. We all ratified it. We all agreed to it. You can't just bow out just because you don't like something. So in his mind, his election to the presidency was not enough to push people out. Not not for nothing though. The southern states that had already seceded were very much in favor of leaving. They were just done. There really was nothing Lincoln could do at that point. And that basically causes a rift between the North and the South. And look, Fort Sumter is where it all comes to a head, because prior to this, in March, when he gives his inaugural address and tries to bring it back in and tries to sew it back together, there had been no firing yet. There was no war. But in April, Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, is attacked. Once there is an attack, and the attack didn't actually do all that much. The painting there makes it seem like this massive battle where so many people would have died. In reality, it was just the Southern batteries firing into Fort Sumter, the Union soldiers that were in the fort kind of sheltering in place. Nobody died. There was no casualty. The only casualty was a horse. There was a horse that was killed, but there was no human death, nothing like that. And it wasn't really a pitched battle, so to speak, as much as it was a siege. And finally, Major Anderson, who was in charge, raised the flag, said, we surrender. They left the fort, and that started the Civil War. Now, of course, the Southerners cheered this. The Northern reaction was, how dare they? Up until this point, there were a number of Northerners that were like, boy, this is just really annoying. Now it's serious. Now it's like, all right, well, that's not that's not the way that you do it. That's not the way you handle it. Not to put too much of a political hat to this, but it's very similar to how there were a number of Trump supporters just a couple of weeks ago that were absolutely backing him, that were supporting his push to about voter fraud and whatever else. And then the Capitol building incident happened, the attempted insurrection. And there were a number of people who were supporting the president who now say, nope, we're done. Like there was, kind of a moment where they were just like, that is not how you do it. If you don't like something, that's not how you do it. And a number of Americans gave up their conviction on that point and changed over to, we need to move on from this president because of that event. And this is very similar to the Northern reaction to Fort Sumter. There were a number of Northerners that kind of were sympathetic towards the Southern cause and kind of said, the Southerners may have a point. There are some issues there. Maybe Lincoln isn't the right guy to sew this back together. But the moment they fire on Fort Sumter, nope, that's it. So there are going to be events that make people change, and violence is no answer, to many of these people. As soon as this happens, you have a number of states secede, and you can see the ones in the gray there were the southern states that did secede. You have the blue states that stay in the Union, so it's very definitely a North versus South mentality. But then there are the key border states, and the border states at this point are Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, which in this map really should be colored red. West Virginia actually separates from Virginia specifically because of the Civil War. Prior to this, it was part of Virginia. Maryland and Delaware. Now, the reason these were called the border states, these are the states that, for the most part, allowed for slavery, for the most part, had Southern sympathies, yet never left the Union. So they were still part of the Union, but they never left. So that's why when I see people in states like Kentucky flying the Confederate flag and saying it's Southern pride, they've never actually opened up their history book. Now, their family generations ago may have fought in the Southern Army, because this is where you get the brother v. brother mentality, where some move south, some move north to fight. But to make it seem like Kentucky was a Confederate state, it was not. It never left. It was part of the Union. Now, again, Kentucky allowed for slavery, so Lincoln kind of let slavery happen in those states because he didn't want them to leave. The most controversial one, of course, would be Maryland, because Maryland borders Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. as a city is right in between Virginia and Maryland. So there was this fear that Maryland would leave to the Confederacy and that our nation's capital would be surrounded by Confederate states. Maryland, however, never did leave. They were a border state. But again, this goes right in line with what Lincoln was trying to do from the very beginning. He was trying to keep the Union together by whatever means necessary. And so he tried not to have too many policies, at least in 1861 and 62, that drove a wedge between, the North versus the South, and especially in the border states. Over time, that's going to change. Over time, he's going to become much more militant about slavery being part of this conflict and being part of the root causes of this conflict. So you're going to see him change from, I've got to keep the Union together, to we've got to keep the Union together. And the way we do that is the elimination of slavery. So that's going to be something that kind of slowly germinates throughout the conflict as well. But again, you have a very distinct North versus South mentality. The states, again, in the blue are the ones that are going to fight the ones that are in gray. And blue versus gray is going to be kind of the uniform colors, the, whatever else on the battlefield. And of course, they're going to have their own symbols, their own flags, their own everything. Okay. Now, okay, the North versus South, very simply put, they have some key differences. The North has the advantage, just numerous advantages. Number one, they are way more manufacturer oriented. They're way more industrial. They have more of the factories. They are able to make the tools of war much easier. They have kind of that industrial base, whereas the South does not. The North has more transportation hubs. They have the bigger cities. They have a much larger population, and quite honestly, a much larger population that can be put into the field as soldiers. They have the established government. The Union government doesn't change. Lincoln is the president, so there's really no question as to who's running their government and how the government functions. So in reality, the North has a boatload of advantages that should put them. I mean, the North should win this war, hands down, based upon their manufacturing, their transportation, their population, all of those, and of course their political advantages as well. The South, however, does have advantages. They do have some. First of all, they're fighting a defensive war. So in order for this war to be over, the North kind of has to go and make them submit to the Northern will. So a defensive war is much easier. You're basically making people come down and fight on your territory to survive under your conditions, and they have to come to you to fight. So that's number one. Number two is they get, in the early stages anyway, they have the better commanders. They have the Stonewall Jacksons. They have the James Longstreet. They have Robert E. Lee, who's arguably the most beloved general in American history. And that says something, because you're talking about a general of the people that seceded. But yet there are people that really admire him in the North as well. Even during the Civil War, people admire him. So again, you have some advantages that you have in the South, where, they're kind of able to create a army that is desperate, because again, they're fighting a defensive war. They're fighting for their homes. They're fighting for their families. They have something to fight for, the Southern cause, as it was. The North really struggled to find that. The North really didn't have that cause, let's go down and make sure that they're part of this union. Well, there are a number of people in the North that say, why do we want them? Mississippi just walked out. Shucks, let's let them go. There were some people in the North that said, hey, why don't you let them break away for a little while and try and survive on their own? They'll be begging to come back. So there are some issues between the North and the South over this. And of course, they're going to have issues about, the North has a Navy, the South does not. They will eventually. They'll build on that. The North has allies. The South is brand spanking new. They're going to try and get the British and the French and the Spanish and some other countries to come and help them. It never actually comes to fruition. The North manages to kind of hold on to that. And that is all because of Lincoln. So again, we're going to be talking kind of a little bit about Lincoln here in a second. The one thing the South, though, kind of leans on is that they are cotton based. They are agrarian, but it's King Cotton. And they realized fairly early on that they were desperately in need of outside help. They needed the English, they needed the French, they needed the Spanish. And the only thing they could do was say, well, we'll give you cotton for much cheaper than we have when we were part of the United States. So they were hoping to bring him in based upon cotton prices. What they didn't count on were that the British and the French were going to find other avenues to get cotton. England, by this point, is farming cotton in places like Egypt. And so their dependence upon cotton plantations of the American South has dropped. And that kills the Southern economy. It also kills the Southern war effort. And since the British needed the cotton, but didn't necessarily need it as much from the South, that's going to wane the British intervention within this conflict, and the British are basically going to side with the Union. Basically throughout the conflict. And the South desperately needs them because, again, the American Navy, the Union Navy, I should put it at this point, was pretty good at locking down the southern ports. Savannah, Charleston, they were blocked in by a blockade of ships, and there was nothing they could do about it. They needed the British Navy to step in or somebody else, and it just never came to fruition. So the Yankee Navy, as it was known, was very good at shutting down southern trade during that time period. And of course, there are issues as well on the outside, because keep in mind, this is not happening in a vacuum. There are other issues to the outside. There are issues of people trying to ram the blockade and basically run the blockade, if you will, utilizing outside influences. And of course, one of them is going to be the British. The British are going to try and help out from time to time, especially private citizens in Britain that realized they could make money off of raiding and running through the blockade. So there are going to be foreign issues that Lincoln has to focus on to try and stop the South from doing this, to try and kind of squeeze the South both economically and politically. But again, it's not like our Civil War is happening just here. It's happening worldwide. Other countries are paying attention to this all the way through. There are Canadian issues during this time period where the British are kind of getting involved with Canadians, and we're starting to question whether or not the Canadians are going to help us, help the South. I mean, there's real legitimate issues all along that frontier, if you will. And of course, there are French issues in Mexico during this time period because the French had taken over from Spain, Mexico, and really kind of caused issues, which then made us wonder, were there going to be issues on the southern border? Were there going to be issues in the territories out west? There are other things that are happening. So just imagine how stressful it would be to be Abraham Lincoln worrying about, well, how do I bring these states that have left the Union back in? But you're also having to deal with foreign diplomacy at the time period too, to your north, to your south, and across the Atlantic as well. Now, of course, Lincoln, we remember Lincoln as president of the United States, but the Confederacy also manages to make their own government. The problem is that Jefferson Davis, who had served as a senator, had served as a secretary of war in the American government. He is the odds-on favorite, and certainly someone that can step in and be the Confederate president. His problem right away is that the Confederate Constitution is a confederacy. A confederacy is a loose association of states. So it's not the United States, it's the Confederate States of America. So what a lot of these states started to realize is that South Carolina left and seceded from the Union because they wanted South Carolina to rule over South Carolina. They didn't want outside influence. So when Jefferson Davis takes over and starts asking these states for supplies, for troops, for whatever else, governors start to say, well, we're not going to do that because we have to protect our country. So you have, instances where, like, the governor of Alabama refuses to send any soldiers up north to fight in Virginia because they've got to stay and, kind of fight and protect Alabama. Jefferson Davis says, well, the Union troops aren't in Alabama, they're up in Virginia. I need them in Virginia to protect the Confederacy. And you have governors saying, well, when they get to Alabama, then they'll fight. So they're almost kind of crippling themselves from the very beginning. The Confederacy did not have their own economy. They of course had an economy set up and everything, but they didn't have their own money, so they had to print their own money, and the money wasn't really printed properly. So there's forgery problems, there's inflation problems, there's all kinds of issues. So Jefferson Davis is starting off with a new constitution for the Confederate States. He's starting off with a job that really isn't defined, and he's starting off with states that aren't refusing to get along politically and economically. So Davis is completely taken out at the legs the moment he takes the oath of office as the Confederate president. And the Confederate Congress doesn't help out much either because they don't really get along. A lot of these states start realizing they're all kind of seceding for their own reasons and not for a collective good. So this is kind of a disaster from the very start. The only thing that really brings them together would be the Army. Robert E. Lee's army brings people together and fights for one cause. That's really the only shining bright spot for the Confederacy, is that they have an army that seemingly can get along and coordinate at least a battle plan that makes sense. But again, Lincoln and Davis could not have more different, jobs, if you will. Lincoln, of course, his job is to keep the Union together, a government that already has a constitution, already has a working form. People are well aware of how it should work. Davis, on the other hand, not so much. Now, of course, the armies couldn't be much more different. I mean, the northern armies, of course, were already set up. They already had an army. They already had a navy. But of course, they are missing a number of soldiers who have gone to the South to fight. So they have to reform the Union Army. They've got to create an army. Well, they do it through a draft. The problem is that when they draft soldiers into the military, it's hard to recruit soldiers in the North to start off, because a number of people in the North are not inspired to go fight in the South. There are some, of course, but not enough to raise the army that they need. So they start drafting people. Well, there are a number of rich people that say, I really don't feel like going and fighting. I don't want to do it. So they start basically paying people to go and serve for them, which was totally legal to do. This is eventually going to cause problems, though, because this starts becoming more and more obvious that wealthy people stay behind and make more money while the poor people go off and fight and die. So this is going to become a problem later on. It's going to cause a number of draft riots, including a major one in New York City that causes a tremendous amount of death and destruction within the city, just because of people basically paying people to go fight for them. And those people finally get fed up with it. The Southern Army, of course, they have their own kind of system of recruitment as well, but it's easier because, again, they have a cause. They have something that they're fighting for. And it is varied, of course. It's not like everybody was fighting for slavery, because the vast majority of the people in the South didn't own slaves. It was mostly just the plantation owners, but there was a feeling like, those Northerners are coming down here and telling us how to live, telling us how to do things. We don't like that. We want them to stay out. We want our states to run themselves. So there is kind of a Southern cause that has nothing to do with slavery per se, but slavery was still part of it, even in a roundabout way, because part of what the Southern governments were standing for was slavery. And of course, the Southern economy couldn't survive without it. So when you hear people say, the Civil War was very complex, but it wasn't just about slavery, they're right. But everything that you could point to and say, hey, that's a Southern cause, still had its roots in slavery as well. So when you hear them, it was all about states' rights. Well, one of the rights that the states were fighting for was, of course, slavery. It was over economics. Well, the Southern economy was built on slavery. So, when you hear people say it wasn't about slavery, they're wrong. It was. Yeah, the root of everything they argued for, slavery was part of it. Okay. And of course, the Northern revenue was coming out of, as I was saying before, manufacturing bases. The Southern revenue was all coming out of cotton. They were completely dependent upon cotton as a crop. So if the price of cotton went down, so too went the South. The South really couldn't survive without it. And so the economics of the different areas, there were successes, but there were mostly failures in the South. And there were successes, but still some failures in the North as well. There's going to be problems of inflation. There's going to be problems of supply. There's going to be problems of economic uncertainty. There's all these things are going to be happening during the Civil War. Because again, the Civil War is not just the guys on the battlefield. It's the people at home trying to make sure that everything is taken care of. And the main thing to remember about the Civil War is that most of the battlefields are going to be in the Southern theater. There are going to be, of course, Northern battles. There are going to be battles in Maryland. There's going to be battles in, Pennsylvania, like Gettysburg. In Maryland, it was Antietam. But for the most part, those battles are very few. I mean, they're massive struggles, don't get me wrong, but most of the massive battles are going to be in the South. So a lot of the battlefields and a lot of the torn up terrain is all going to be Southern. Okay, so the Civil War is going to have a major impact upon society as well, because you could be just sitting there. And one of the weirdest stories is the story of Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean is at the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas Junction. He owns a house there. And the two armies come out for the very first major engagement of the Civil War. And during it, a cannonball goes and hits into his house, and he says, that does it. I'm moving out. I'm getting out of this place. And so he moves his family from Manassas Junction because he wants them away from the war. He finds a little quiet place called Appomattox Courthouse. And he settles, and weirdly enough, 4 years later, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant in his house. So very famously, Wilmer McLean could say that the war started in his first house and ended in his front parlor at the end of the war. And if you watch the Ken Burns video I assigned to you from yesterday, that was the story they started off with. But that happened all the time in the Civil War because, I mean, these small little podunk towns, nobody would have ever heard of Gettysburg had it not been for the Civil War. Nobody would have ever thought of Antietam or some of these other major battles. Most Americans wouldn't know where Vicksburg is if it weren't for the Civil War. So again, the Civil War is fought on the battlefields here, and the people have to deal with it. And of course, women are going to get more involved. If you really want to read a phenomenal book about the Civil War, there's a book called Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy, and it's about four women that helped in some way or influenced in some way the Civil War. One was a soldier, so she faked her gender to go and sign up as a soldier. One as a spy. One is basically somebody that, I mean, a spy in general, but utilizing her feminine wiles to gain information from soldiers and from military leadership. And then you have one that becomes basically a nurse and surgeon on the battlefields. So, this book that I'm referencing here is a snapshot on how women were fighting the war without maybe being on the front lines. Of course, one of them actually was on the front lines, and there were numerous that did. But again, women have a tremendous impact upon the Civil War and gain a tremendous amount of respect during the Civil War. Clara Barton starts the Red Cross during the Civil War. I mean, all these things are happening during the Civil War. So women are gaining a tremendous foothold in the American political theater and, of course, in the economy during this time period. Even in the South, you have men going off to fight, and women are having to run the households. They're having to run the plantations. They're having to, figure out how the farm should run and prosper and survive while the men go off to war. If you ever watch the movie Gone with the Wind, that's all about a Southern woman trying to kind of keep her plantation up and running during the Civil War. So again, there are going to be issues, especially economic issues, all throughout the war. So don't forget that there's always going to be an impact. War always has an impact upon the economy. Now, the actual fighting starts, like I said, I just referenced Bull Run or Manassas. It starts there. This is literally a battle where the Congress of the United States really thinks that once the American military starts walking down into Virginia, once they walk down and kind of march into Southern territory, they have this vision that the Southerners who have stupidly signed up to fight this will just go, oh my God, they're too well trained. Look at this army. We got to run. We got to save our lives. So they literally think that that's what's going to happen. So a number of congressmen actually take blankets and a picnic lunch with their families out to the battle. They're going to watch the battle because they literally think it's going to be American army walks in, Southern army runs away. That is not what happens. The Southern Army stands like a stone wall, which is where General Thomas Jackson is going to get his nickname Stonewall Jackson. And basically, it's going to be an embarrassment to the American military. The Union Army runs. The Southern Army carries the day. And so it's really kind of a black eye on the American military. Because of that, Lincoln realizes I need to switch things up. I need to get somebody that's going to kind of organize the army and really strike some fear into the South. So he puts that all in the hands of a guy named George McClellan, the guy pictured here. George McClellan has a master strategy. He's got this all planned out. He's got like kind of this playbook of what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. And he comes up with this idea that we have to go attack Richmond because Richmond is their capital city. And he has this mentality that, well, if we can take the Confederate capital, they'll give up. Okay, which is an old school strategy that really doesn't matter here because, as I said before, the Confederacy is not going to worry that some city in Richmond that happens to be the Confederate capital is taken. The people in Georgia are still fighting. The people in South Carolina are still fighting. They're not worried that you took a city in Virginia. But McClellan is fighting basically a war in the 1700s while living in the 1800s. Okay, so his mentality is very British in nature from the American Revolution, and it's not really going to work. Needless to say, when he starts this idea of a peninsular campaign where he's going to move his army, use the Navy to move his army down to the peninsula that leads up to Richmond, his idea is we land the troops, we have an amphibious landing basically, and we march up the peninsula, we scare the living bejesus out of the Confederate army, they run, we take Richmond, war over. It doesn't happen that way. And it's because while McClellan may have grand visions and plans, when it comes to actually carrying them out, he's really not very good at it. And it's because he is constantly fearing that he's outnumbered. For some god-awful reason, he was paranoid that Robert E. Lee has thousands more troops in reserve that he can't see. And so he keeps on, contacting Lincoln. I need more troops. You need to send me more troops. I need more guns. I need more cannons. Oh my God, we're outnumbered. And so he kind of talks himself out of good strategies and plans. And because of that, it fails. So the grand vision collapses upon itself. And when it collapses, like a true egomaniacal maniac, McClellan, instead of looking in a mirror saying, you know what, I did this to myself, he blames Lincoln. And it's not a good idea to blame your boss. Okay. So needless to say, he eventually gets removed. I'm going to skip over this because it's not really that important to our study here. The battles of 1862 don't go much better for the North. The North really kind of fails here because they go back to fight at Manassas again, and the reason was it was a railroad junction. So they thought if we can take Manassas, we'll kind of cripple the South and their ability to move troops and supplies. Well, they fail again, and then they end up at Antietam, and after loss after loss after loss after loss, they finally get not really a victory, but a tie. Antietam basically is a tie. It's counted as a Union victory because the Southern Army left and it was in Virginia. So since the South ran back into Virginia, and Antietam is in Maryland, and the North kind of held on to their own territory, they claimed it as a victory. The only reason that Antietam really is a victory is because they used the good news of, hey, we actually had a good day, to produce the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation basically, it does not free the slaves entirely. This is always a misnomer about this and misunderstood. What it does is it says that from this point on, the areas in rebellion, which are the states in gray, the states that had committed to the Confederacy, when those states are taken over, when we take over territory, when our army takes over those and kind of brings them back in, that any slave within that district, in that region, will be freed. So now what it does is it provides a little extra incentive to our armies to take over regions. If we take over a region, our army now acts as an army of emancipation. They have something to fight for. So this is very important to the Union Army's push to fight this conflict. Okay. Now the reaction, of course, in the North, a lot of abolitionists say it's not going far enough because you're saying yes, now they're free, but what about the slaves in the border states? What about the slaves in Kentucky and Maryland? You're kind of cheating them out just because their states didn't leave. So there are those issues. And the abolitionists also are a little upset that Lincoln took so long to get to this point. At the same time, of course, Southerners are going to be opposed to this, and they're going to fight even harder to make sure that because now they legitimately are fighting for their homeland. They're fighting for their way of life, so to speak. So it's very controversial, but it still requires a constitutional amendment at the end of the war, the 13th Amendment, to actually free the slaves. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation may free some, but not all. And of course, there are questions at this point of what to do with African Americans. Should they serve in the military? And there was big pushback in North and South as to what to do when it came to black soldiers. The North is the first one to do it under the promotion of Frederick Douglass, the famous runaway slave who had become a leader in the abolitionist movement. He manages to convince Lincoln and other leaders within the American military and political elite that black soldiers, it's important for them to be involved because they have to fight for the emancipation. They have to bleed on the battlefields. They have to show that they are equal, because otherwise you're going to free an entire group of people, assuming you win, and there's going to be hurt feelings about, people in my family died and none of you stood up for it. Right or wrong or indifferent, they had convinced Lincoln of the necessity of these guys to become part of the army. And why they served, of course, as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation comes in, a lot of these soldiers who are freed slaves themselves want to go down and rescue family members. They want to go down and emancipate their brothers and sisters that are in bondage. They want to be part of this. And an excellent film, of course, is Glory. If you've never seen Glory, every American, in my opinion, should watch Glory. It's a phenomenal film. It's one of those films that really tries to do it right. Of course, there are going to be historical inaccuracies in any historically based film, but they try to minimize it and tell the story. So if you've never seen it, you really should. And it's about the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first African American units in the Northern Army. There are some Southern units of African American soldiers, not many, but there are some. And there are some that, kind of fought for the Southern way of life. As weird as it sounds, they were fighting for their families, so to speak. Okay. But it was way more prevalent in the North. Okay. Now, of course, the turning point of the war, the turning point of the Civil War is Gettysburg. Gettysburg is a 3-day struggle in July of 1863. And it's kind of a titanic struggle day over the course of 3 days that culminates in one of the most iconic images and events of the Civil War. On day one, the two sides pretty much kind of like feel each other out, and the Union manages to outmaneuver the Confederate Army and take the high ground. Now, back in this style of fighting, the high ground is important because you're fighting above. The people that are fighting you have to walk up towards you. It's an advantage to have the high ground. Well, they managed to get it on the first day. So the second day, they managed to hold the heights. And this propels a little known guy from Maine, a guy named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, to being a national hero. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain leads the 20th Maine. The 20th Maine is a regiment from, obviously, Maine that has the extreme right of the Union Army. They are on the very end of the line, and they know that if they don't hold the line and they cave in, that means the Confederate Army can swing around and basically encircle the Union Army. He's got to fight to the very last. Okay, if you ever want to watch a great film, watch the movie called Gettysburg, or read the book that it's based on, The Killer Angels, and it shows you why Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is such an important and valuable person to the Civil War, because he makes the decisions that eventually, quite honestly, wins the battle, because it turns the tide of the war. The third day pretty much, signals the end of the Confederacy. They just don't know it yet. This is Pickett's charge, the last-ditch effort by Lee to try and break the Union line at Gettysburg. He sends an entire division, and it's quite honestly multiple divisions, but Pickett gets the credit because he was in the lead of it. George S. Pickett, sends his soldiers across the open field, about 1.5 miles in length, 1.25 miles, over an open field, getting shelled by cannonballs, getting hit by musket balls, and they try and break the Union lines in the center. It's a bloody disaster. It's a horrible, horrible decision. Lee basically, for whatever reason, there are a number of historians that think he might have been having a heart attack during that time period and just was showing poor judgment because of that. We're not sure, but for whatever reason, whether he thought his army was invincible, we're not sure. In the end, it was a terrible mistake. Pickett never forgives Lee for this because so many of his men died. And it basically cripples the Confederate Army. And of course, a few months later, in November of 1863, Abraham Lincoln goes out to Gettysburg and dedicates the cemetery. So the Gettysburg Address is him dedicating not just the cemetery, but also kind of redefining and reframing what the war is all about. And of course, he can do that because now they're starting to win. And they're starting to win in the West as well because they finally found their fighting man. Whereas McClellan was a pain in the rear end and couldn't seem to get things done. And they went through a whole host of replacement generals. I mean, they went through general after general after general, and Lincoln could never quite seem to find the right guy. In the West, they found a guy named Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses Grant basically was a guy that's realized what McClellan did. Whereas McClellan was always worried that we don't have enough soldiers, we don't have enough guns. We don't have enough this or that or the other. Grant always knew, hey, I've got a statistical advantage in everything and I'm going to use it. And so he kind of figured, well, if I got to lose a number of soldiers, to take a position and win a battle, well, then that's what I'm going to do. And so he kind of was a bloody guy. He basically was an all-out war type of mentality, but because of that, he put the Confederates on complete defensive and many times running away. And he won battles at places like Shiloh. He, along with the American Navy, managed to secure New Orleans, and they secure Vicksburg as well. All of that happens by 1863. So as we're winning the Battle of Gettysburg in the East, Ulysses S. Grant is securing the West and the Mississippi River for the Union Army as well. Because of those successes, Lincoln elevates Grant to the leadership of the entire Union Army. And it's at that point that Lee kind of realizes that it's only a matter of time, because Grant's strategy is something that the Confederates cannot keep up with. If Grant can lose thousands of soldiers and get new recruits in to replace them, Lee does not have that. So just the numeric advantage alone, Grant realized he had the ability to win the war based upon that. Okay. And of course, that is what inspires Sherman's March to the Sea, when basically Grant's first action as overall Union commander is to tell his friend William Sherman, who is also from Ohio. Grant and Sherman are both Ohio guys. He basically says, Sherman, you have the right to march to the sea. You have the right to basically go down, take Atlanta, and Shermanize it. Okay. And this was this idea of, you are an army of emancipation. Everywhere you go, you are emancipating people. He attacks Atlanta and lays siege to it and eventually wins. And then his march to the sea is literally his march from Atlanta out to Savannah, where he basically burns every plantation that they come across. He tears up every railroad line. He just basically destroys everything in his path. And if you ever watch Gone with the Wind, that's the second half of the film, is they're just tearing up all that territory in there, and Sherman is still spat upon him in the South. He is not considered a very nice guy by any stretch. The effects of the march is it cripples the Southern economy. They cannot keep up this war effort much longer because of this. And quite honestly, this is what eventually wins Lincoln his second term in office. And of course, in 1864, they're running a political campaign. Lincoln actually has to run for re-election, and believe it or not, has to run a pretty strong campaign, because he gets a pretty hard challenge from a guy he fired. The guy that challenges him is George B. McClellan. The soldiers love George McClellan. Even though he was really ineffective as a general, the soldiers kind of liked him because he always had these grand visions and plans, and they kind of bought into it. And a lot of people in the North really kind of liked McClellan because they thought he got a raw deal, and it's not his fault that Lincoln couldn't get him the right supplies and couldn't get him the right soldiers, even though that was completely bogus. McClellan managed to get his name in the papers enough that he was a hero. Well, so sure enough, the Democrats come along and say, all right, well, we're going to nominate McClellan to run against Lincoln. And Lincoln, by the 1864, people are so war weary that they're looking for a change. And there were some people in the Democratic Party known as Copperheads. These were people that were called Copperheads because they were weakening the war effort. They were legitimately kind of, biting us and being venomous and kind of saying, well, this would be the time period now that the war is kind of, tipping our way, but we're tired of this. Maybe we should go down and start negotiating with the South to bring him back in. Lincoln says, we did not fight this war to negotiate him back in to do what we did prior to, meaning we're not going to bring him back in and allow them to have slavery again. We're on the battlefields because of slavery. The Copperheads were kind of saying, well, you're just a wartime president. All you want to do is hurt people. And so the rhetoric from the Copperheads was very detrimental to the war effort. And so Lincoln kind of feels like before this election, like he's going to lose. And even though the popular vote is, somewhat equitable, you'll notice the Electoral College is overwhelming in favor of Lincoln. Okay, so Lincoln kind of coasts to re-election. Now, why does he coast to re-election in the Electoral College? It's because Grant is basically kicking tail at this point. Sherman is the one that's doing it. And so Lincoln has a tremendous amount of good fortune that the war had turned so much so by 1864 that everybody kind of saw the end coming. And were willing to allow Lincoln to do it. And sure enough, before you know it, in April of 1865, Grant basically had replaced Meade. He becomes the commanding general of the entire war effort, and kind of goes into the field and drives home the point and basically beats Robert E. Lee. And by that point, Grant basically sues for peace, or basically offers it up, and Lincoln sues for it. And peace negotiations take place, like I said, in Appomattox Courthouse. This is Wilmer McLean's front parlor, or at least the depiction by the artist. I'm sure it was much smaller than this, and there certainly weren't as many people in the room when this happened. So this is the artist's rendering of it, but in reality, it was just a small little front living room, if you will, of a house where they negotiated. They did negotiate over a very small table, and Grant really shows a tremendous amount of diplomacy here, because he realizes that Lee is no longer an enemy. He's a fellow American, and he grants a number of different shall we say, diplomatic concessions, if you will. He kind of says, your guys can leave. I'm not going to put them into, camps and make them prisoners of war. If you're willing to say, well, they're not going to fight anymore, they can just drop their weapons and they can go home. He says, officers can carry their weapons back to their house. I'm not going to, disarm them completely. So Grant is super friendly to Lee, conciliatory almost, as long as Lee's willing to kind of say, we're no longer going to fight anymore. Because there was a fear that some of these guys would go off into the hills and fight a guerrilla campaign. Grant basically says, look, I'm not going to do anything to you guys. I'm not going to arrest anybody, because look, Lee has committed treason. By leading this army, these guys had committed treason against the United States government. What do we do to people that commit treason? We hang them. Every government in the world had kind of, put these guys in front of a firing squad. Grant looks at Lee and says, just go home. If you can convince your guys that, hey, go home, your war is over, and they don't cause any problems, then we're not going to have any problem. So he almost kind of sets the tone for the post-war world, that these guys will not ever have to answer. Lee is never hauled in front of a military tribunal and charged with treason. He's never, threatened with, hey, we're going to string you up and we're going to kill you. The only person that ever has to really deal with that is Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis, because he's the president of the Confederacy, will have that issue. But the military leaders do not. None of the generals are ever strung up. Nobody's ever, the only people that were ever really strung up for their actions during the war were the commandants of things like Andersonville Prison, where there were some serious war crimes, but none of the actual guys in the field were ever hanged for their actions. Okay. Of course, this era of good feeling was very short-lived, because the day that all the people were celebrating this, it turns into an absolute horrific event with Lincoln's assassination. John Wilkes Booth and his merry band of assassins were going to go around and not only kill Lincoln, but also kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson, and kill people like the Secretary of State, William Seward, and a whole host of other American political leaders, because their whole idea was to take out all of the leadership at the very top, to inspire a tremendous amount of fear and kind of almost decapitate the American political system. Booth, unfortunately, was very successful in what he wanted to do. He did manage to kill the president at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. And of course, he shoots him in the back of the head, basically behind the ear. The bullet actually lodges up in his just behind his eye. He slowly dies overnight. There is no chance, of course, as soon as the doctors look at it, they say this is a mortal wound. It's just a matter of time. Lincoln never regains consciousness. His wife, who was already on the borderline of sanity, loses it entirely after that. She's never the same. In fact, his son Robert's going to have to commit his own mother to a mental institution later on in life, because she was already, like I said, pretty unstable. And it was because of the death of her children. She had two sons die. So, I mean, she had a whole host of problems. It's not just Lincoln's assassination, but that had a lot to do with it as well. Lincoln's death, of course, brings a complete end to all the celebratory nature of the war coming to an end. A lot of the people that were kind of on the fence about how to handle the South now want retribution. They want the South to pay now, whereas Lincoln didn't want that. He wanted them in his second inaugural. He says, with malice towards none. He wants it to be a amicable makeup. That is not going to happen once Lincoln is killed. And of course, it kind of silences a lot of the hurt feelings from the Lincoln presidency, because I think a lot of historians really kind of skip over the fact that, had Lincoln lived, let's say Lincoln was not assassinated, after the war is done, he's going to have a reckoning for some of the things that he had done during his presidency. He did suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and writ of habeas corpus says that if I arrest you, I have to charge you with something. I can't just hold you in prison for months at a time. I have to charge you with something. You have to be informed of the crime that you are being accused of. Well, he suspends that all the way through. If somebody is a problem, he's just going to lock them up. Well, that's a violation of the Constitution. Could he have been impeached? He could have. Lincoln could have maybe seen a general fallout after the election or after the Civil War. So the assassination almost kind of puts an end to that, which almost elevates him to sainthood immediately, because they stopped talking about all the problems they had with him politically and started talking about him as kind of the savior of the Union. So again, and of course, the great emancipator as well. So again, the results of the war are going to be kind of our conduit into Reconstruction, where it's how do we treat the Southerners coming back in? How do we refuse the Union? How do we bring it back together economically, politically, socially? And what do we do about slavery as well? There are a number of questions that have to be answered, but that is all going to be answered during Reconstruction, and some of the answers aren't very good. Reconstruction is one of the darkest times in American history, but I'll talk about that in another presentation. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, certainly raise them. Tomorrow I'm going to be presenting about Lincoln's second inaugural and then talking a little bit more about the assassination. Again, if you have any questions, reach out through office hours, reach out through email. I'm hoping exams are going okay and that you guys are at least kind of winding down the first semester without too much emotion or too much stress. I know that goes without saying. Sometimes stress is just the name of the game. But again, if you have questions or concerns, please reach out.